Hey guys, it's Clovis. In this video I'm going to talk about 5 things I would change about Duels of the Roses. Duels of the Roses is one of my favourite games ever, it's no secret, but it obviously has its flaws, it has a lot of problems with the game, and mostly stuff that I usually overlook because I've just kind of accepted the game is very flawed and kind of got over some of these things, but sometimes when I feel really exhausted of the games and just in general feel like, you know, the replay value's lacking, there's just problems with the game that make me want to stop playing it, and I just wanted to list some reasons, or rather things that I would change in the game that would make it better and more replayable. So without further ado, here are the 5 things I would change about Duels of the Roses. Alright, so the first thing I personally would change is I would make sure everyone could level up faster. Every monster in the game should really be able to level up faster. The leveling system in this game is just far too slow. First of all, I think a meter to track your progress is kind of necessary. They actually first wanted, like, this was in the game at some point and they removed it. You can see it in the Japanese intro of the game. It's not actually in the Japanese version of the game, but in the Japanese intro you can actually see the XP values on the cards when looking at them. I think this is actually very necessary because, especially when a lot of people were playing younger, there was no information on leveling up and nobody knew how long it would take, and it took people a while to figure out how long it actually took to fully rank stuff up because it gets slower and slower as you go. It just gets exponentially slower as you go. So after working really hard to get a few ranks, it's a big problem because it just takes literally hours of grinding to actually get levels, and you don't know what leader abilities you're going to get. You're not guaranteed to get them. Obviously we have all this information now, but there was a good 10 years or so of the game being out where people still didn't actually know all the leader abilities, and it was purely because the leveling system was just completely fucked. I really genuinely believe that it was faster and they slowed it down because they thought it was too fast, but they just overcompensated for it, because I really don't think there's any other reason why it should be this slow. You're not going to get a leader ability, like 95% of the time you're not going to get a leader ability. This game sold, you know, a million copies or whatever, like multi-million copies, and I assume probably 1% or less than 1% of the people who actually played the game ever experienced a leader ability because it just took way too long to level up. People probably put the game down before they actually got a leader ability, and it's a problem because they actually put quite a bit of effort into the leader abilities and how they work and interact with the different archetypes. They're actually quite intricate. They're not perfect, but for the game standards, they're actually very good. They're one of the things I'm most passionate about in this game that I think really adds like a whole new dimension to the game, but people just don't care or don't know about it because it's just really not worth it sometimes. It's just not worth spending all that time leveling up when you don't even know what leader abilities you're gonna get. I would argue to actually affect the values more both ways in this case, like make it more punishing to lose but also more rewarding to win. You wouldn't have to do it that way, but if that's the way they wanted to balance it, that would be a lot better way to do it. But I think just the leader ability system in the game is too good to keep it buried underneath the game, and having a legitimate way to level cards up by actually, you know, winning duels, doing stuff like, you know, Forbidden Memories, which I don't play it that much, so don't ask me too many questions about it, but you get a rating when you win a duel and that determines what card you win. They should have implemented a system like that in Duels of the Roses that gives you experience depending on how efficient you did the duel. That way, if you were to grind, you could grind duels, but otherwise the only way to do it is, you know, a method that players have actually had to come up with where you just skip turns with face-up cards, or what some people do, which is actually a lot slower and more time-consuming, is to repeatedly destroy monsters. And, you know, again, this is stuff that took 16 years or so to get all the proper information out of it, and it's still just unacceptable. I genuinely believe I've come up with the fastest method to level up cards, and setting up the right deck for this and like the optimal fastest way to do everything. The fastest I've been able to level up a card from nothing to Secretary of Defense was 5 hours and 40 minutes, and that is legitimately the fastest way of actually like maxing out a rank on someone. So it's actually quite disgusting how slow it is to fully rank something, and half the archetypes just don't get any leader abilities like at all until later on, or they just get really basic useless ones early. So the likeliness of a player, unless they pick the Air Knight Parshaft deck like as, you know, their starter deck, and they played with a lot of Air Knight Parshafts in their deck throughout the playthrough, the chances of getting leader ability by the time you finish the game are just, they practically may as well be 0. So yeah. So another thing I would do is remove the deck cost cap in the post game. This is a huge problem. I always thought it was really bad about the game. Like, even when I was younger, I thought it made no sense, and the more and more I think about it, I really feel like it was just lazy, or they just did not think about it whatsoever, because it's just a huge problem. So when you beat both sides of the game, the map opens up all duelists. So, you know, you've already beat the game, there's no really reward to winning other than being able to farm their cards from the graveyard slots. But, considering your deck cost has to be lower than the opponent's, it means you're forced to have a deck that has essentially, you know, somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 deck cost, so you can actually duel opponents like Yugi, Seto Kaiba. You can duel a few of the 1,000 deck cost duels, there's quite a few of them, but if your deck cost is over 1,000, it means you can't duel like 2/3, maybe even 3/4 of the duelists in the game. So essentially you're forced to have a deck cost of like 900 to 1,000, which is reasonably like the lowest deck cost you're going to have if you want to include anything cool in your deck. Or you're forced to just essentially not use the higher deck cost cards, which are obviously the best cards in the game. Not just the best cards in the game, but the more fun ones, you know, all the ace monsters and stuff like that, the ones people actually want to fucking use. All those really powerful, cool cards that are like 80 deck cost or whatever, and all the high deck cost monsters. You can't really duel with many of these in your deck because you can't duel anyone except the final bosses with them. And, you know, once you've already beat them, I know it doesn't really matter, but it's like, the point of having all these cool cards in the game and opening up the whole map, it should be for you to be able to do whatever the fuck you want, and you can't because you have to have your deck cost lower than the opponent. So constantly when I'm making decks, especially when I make videos for the game, I have to always keep the deck cost into consideration, and now I'm just permanently in the habit of keeping my deck cost low for the sake of being able to duel multiple opponents, and that means none of my decks that I make actually include higher deck cost cards, because the lower deck cost cards, stuff like Dark Piercing Light, Magical Neutralizing Force Field, Curse Breakers, there's no reason to shove higher deck cost cards in the deck when you can use those, when they're arguably better than some of the higher deck cost cards in the deck. So what happens is, if I want to duel majority of people, most of my decks just end up having 3 Curse Breakers in it, 3, you know, just like 7, 8 equips, all this really like low shit, so I just genuinely feel like it's kind of pointless to restrict the player after opening up the game for them. It kind of becomes a sandbox, you know, by the time you beat all the duelists and you have a lot of the cards, the fun is to create all the decks that you want to create, you know, play with all the cards you want to play, but you can't do it. You can't have this huge deck with all these cool cards unless you duel the same 2 or 4 opponents depending on your deck cost repeatedly. There's 21 duels in the game, and unless your deck cost is 757, you can't duel all of them, so that means if you want a 757 deck cost, you need to have a deck that has just no good high deck cost cards in it, unless your entire deck is like 10 deck cost or lower, then you can stick a few powerful cards in it, but you don't necessarily always want to do that, you know. That means you're forced to play with something like a plant deck with a bunch of strong shit in it, whereas, you know, you probably want to play other monster types like warriors and fiends and stuff like that. So, essentially, you know, packing your deck full of low deck cost cards just so you can play the enemy defeats the purpose of opening up the entire map so you can duel all the opponents. So another thing I would do is add a challenge mode, like a New Game Plus, and this ties in with this point. I think the game needs to just be balanced a bit better overall. So I understand unlocking the full map is kind of like their idea of New Game Plus, but there's no actual incentive to go back and duel any of the duelists unless you're collecting all the cards. So, and this creates a problem. Again, I'm going to bring this up in a later point, but you can't actually collect all the cards, so technically there's nothing to actually do once you unlock the whole map, so a challenge mode would be way more better. First of all, let's just talk about, you know, how the AI sucks. We all know the AI sucks. I'm not going to sit here and say they should have made the AI better, because if they could have, I assume they would have. What they really should have done is compensate for how the AI wasn't so good by giving them more consistent decks. This is a massive problem. Some of the decks in the game just have really bad inconsistency problems, and that just results the enemies just making moves that they obviously should not play. One example, something like Keith, who just randomly has like a mechanical spider in his deck when he has all these other really strong creatures, is if he draws that, considering it's low summon star, he's gonna play it. So even if he plays like Barrel Dragon in Slot Machine, Machine King, puts like 3, well, I guess 2 limited removals on them and all these equips and stuff like that, you know, if you're in a position like that, you really can't win that duel unless your deck's set up right. Unless, of course, he randomly draws Mechanical Spider and decides to play it because of the bot algorithm, and then you attack that card because it's like 400 attack and you do shit tons of damage. So this is just one example of a problem that comes up a lot where you win duels you shouldn't win because of the enemy's inconsistencies, and that actually happens the other way around. You know, you lose duels you shouldn't because the AI just randomly pulls out their strongest card and just plays it, activates it instantly when the rest of their deck seems to be really, really bad. Sometimes decks like Taya will just, sometimes they'll pull off all their combos perfectly, maybe 1 out of 100 times, then the other 99 out of 100 times they're not even going to do jack shit to do any of their synergy with all their light support or whatever. Another problem is something like Ishtar. Ishtar's deck just has a bunch of random stuff, like it has Komori Dragon in the deck, which can be used for a fusion like Seeking Dragon, which can be added with the Thunder card to make a twin-headed Thunder Dragon. Problem with that is, if she just plays Komori Dragon on its own, it's just, like, there's no reason for that, opponent to ever want to do that, if that card is in their deck. They would only have to do it if that's what the draw resulted in. So essentially, with a water field and a crush field, they play a 1500 attack dragon that's not strong on water and can't move on to the crush, and it's just a brick in their hand. Costs them 4 summoning power, that fucks up their next turn, and overall, it's just AI being bad just creates more problems one after the other. If they made the decks way more consistent, then the AI would always play more consistently, and people would have a more solid experience playing against them. For some people, some duelists like Richard or Ishtar might give them a hard time. Other duelists might find, other players might find both of those duelists to be a complete pushover, and I think that's a huge problem with the game. The game should really have more linear difficulty. It really doesn't. Duelists are just placed in an order that completely ignores difficulty. If you look at duelists like Mai is just infinitely harder than pretty much all the duelists after her, including Yugi, before the final boss. Her deck just has way more power-ups and good field advantage. It also has support cards that synergize with each other. Overall, her deck is one of the few in the game that actually synergize with each other. Someone like her or like Panic with, basic lead abilities and the terrain advantage and some power-ups just become way better duelists than all these ones that come after them, like, Joey, Shardy, Bakura, Grandpa, that, are just like a gimmick deck. Very weak. They play really, really, really badly, so the problem there is, once you beat Mai, you may as well have defeated the whole fucking game, essentially, because there's no duelist after Mai until the final boss that are really that difficult. So once you defeat Mai, the next 4 or 5 duelists, which is essentially the rest of the campaign after you've just beat the first few, is pretty much a pushover. And I think that's just a huge problem with the game. They should really have put the difficulty of the duelists into consideration. The Red Rose side is a bit different because it's not linear, you can take different paths. They did a lot better job with that side, but the other side's just a joke, You duel Mai, you duel Meiko, if you can beat them, you can easily defeat Joey, Shardy, Bakura. So it's just, yeah. Even Grandpa, even Yugi. Yugi's deck is just so inconsistent and so bad. I know he has plot armor in the real show, and that's why he, his deck just makes no sense because it's just a bunch of monsters he uses from the anime. But they basically just gave him all the cards that he normally uses, including the ones like Sword of Revealing Light and Mirror Force, and basically expected him to be a difficult duel because he can actually use these cards that are stronger than the cards everyone else has, but his deck overall is really, really bad. He'll do stuff like he'll put an equip on Dark Magician and then activate the Magician of Black Chaos Ritual and just get rid of that and, destroy his own resources and just all this shit they just did not consider about, just ruins the game. And another problem with this game overall is the fact that the learning curve is so steep, which, having a learning curve in a game isn't innately bad, but the problem with this game is you're pretty much clueless how to do anything in this game. It's extremely difficult and you have no idea how to figure it out until you get to a point where suddenly it's too easy. Once you have enough cards that are good and you've learned enough about the AI, the game just becomes a complete pushover to a point where it's just not a challenge. You kind of know you've won a duel before you go into it, unless you purposely give yourself a really, really bad deck. And, especially a player like me who's been playing on and off since the game came out, it's just impossible to actually have any form of engagement or fun of this game without doing something like speedrunning it, which, isn't an innate part of the game. It's not really supposed to be. speedrun or anything, but there's no other way to really challenge yourself in this game. That's the problem. People literally have to use stuff like timers and stream runs of the game to actually give it an interesting challenge at this point, so that's a bit of a problem. One thing in regards to replay value and the balance and all this is they really should have added more duels, and I think also a duel room would have been nice. I know they open up the whole map, but they could have really stuck a duel room in the menu to allow you to duel whoever you've defeated before or encountered before. So even though this is technically the sequel to Forbidden Memories, this has just over half the duels that game has, which is disappointing because far more potential like in this game for the archetypes and the strategies between all the spells and trap cards you could use. You could also, there's a lot of potential in terms of what you could put on the board, like the actual map, the field of each duel. You can do so many puzzles like, mazes or crush fields, stuff like that. Even just in general, just blocking off the player or just having more interesting setups that are cool to look at, even if they're not that particularly challenged or they're not supposed to be. You could just have a lot more early duels, a lot more, intermediate duels that have like a bit of a gimmick to them, and a lot of late game duels that are really challenging that use like really broken combos because, as I said before with the consistency issues, something like, imagine Skull Knight, right? If he never uses his burn cards, he never kills you, but one duel he's gonna equip 2 Ryokus to a monster on his first turn, and the next turn he's gonna use Tremendous Fire, and that means he's gonna kill you within the second turn. If the AI knew he could do that, he would do that every single time he drew those cards, and it would be really, really, really difficult to beat him without immediately countering him. So you could technically, considering you pass the game and you move on to the next side or unlock the full map after you beat the enemy boss once, you could potentially just duel against the enemy boss once, and it's the easiest duel of your life because he didn't draw the right cards. Other times, he might draw the best cards he can possibly draw, the best combos. Within the first 3 times you duel him, and you think, this is bullshit, this is impossible. A good solution to this is to make the duels more consistent and add more of them. So that, for instance, you could have Skull Knight doing his own gimmick more consistently, then you could implement another duel that's mostly focused around trap cards. You could implement another duel that really wants to summon really, really strong rituals or something like that, and actually properly augment that strategy by using cards that provide more material in the first turn and stuff like that. So overall, just, more replay value to the game. This also ties in with, the removing the deck cost cap. The fact that you can only really duel a few enemies at the game with like a deck cost of 1,000 or just above 1,000 is ridiculous. You really should be able to have access to like 40 or even more duels potentially. I mean, if I had all the time in the world and I was doing the development of this game, I would have volunteered to do all this shit for free if it was within my power to do so. Because I really just feel like the duels in the game are just not substantial. There's only a few that are actually like challenging, and then because of the game's nature, once you know them, they're not really challenging anymore anyways. I feel like if there was a more variety and people did like more broken strategies and more nasty combos, it would have just been a lot more challenging to play through and try and beat all these duels. So yeah, I reckon add more duels, like a duel room or something, and balance the game a bit better. Also would be a good way to introduce more characters into the Shin Duel Monsters universe, which would add to the story, and yeah, there's just, there's so much more potential. This is a suggestion, like a miscellaneous one, but I really think the board should be 9x9. I mean, I know it wouldn't be 8x8 because then you couldn't have the deck leaders start opposite each other, so make it 9x9. 7x7 is actually just ridiculously small when you think about it, especially when you add labyrinth tiles. One thing I always wanted in this game, or what I always thought would be the case, is the labyrinth would be walls between tiles, which makes sense, because if you remember the anime duel where the Paradox brothers, that whole duel is based around, it's a maze, like that's what a labyrinth is, it's a maze, but when you go into the duels, every single labyrinth means there's one tile less to access, so what happens is, I still vividly remember this from day one when I went to the Labyrinth Duel. I was expecting there to be a maze, and I saw 3 lines of blocks, and I was extremely fucking disappointed. I have no idea why that Labyrinth Maze Duel is just 3 lines with a few crush tiles. I think it's really, really lazy, and if you had 9x9 tiles and labyrinth walls, the potential for like the actual maps in this game, like the fields, whatever, would just be through the roof. I mean, already it's pretty high, but adding that dimension onto it would double, maybe even triple the potential for it. It's actually insane how much of a difference that would make, and it would, facilitate a more slow-paced game, which I think the game really wanted to be. The best way to actually play the game, even if you had like multiplayer, would just be to rush the opponent with really strong combos, but Playing a slow game is really difficult when the enemy can just leap across the map first turn with Dimension Hole and kill you. So I know they didn't really consider that, but if it was a 9x9 thing, that wouldn't really be as big an issue. You'd be able to have like lots of slow-paced, long-drawn-out duels, which I think more people would have fun. It would give you more playtime in the game as well. Overall, you know, you could always have fast-paced duels and slow-paced duels, different size ones. You could even add labyrinth blocks around the edge of a 9x9 thing to make it a 7x7 one, forcing the player into a smaller environment, or it just splits the map up a little bit better. There's just so much potential between all these things that I'm really disappointed that, you know, you have a 7x7 grid and a labyrinth tile blocks you from being able to do anything unless you have a card that goes on labyrinth. So the last one, arguably one of the most important points, I think, is they really should have made all the cards unlockable. They could have even implemented a shop system. I really am not sure why this game doesn't have a shop system. I guess they compensated for that with the graveyard slots and the reincarnation, which is really, really cool. But for all those cards you can't really unlock with those methods, they probably could have stuck them in a shop system or added some way to unlock them. And, you know, even added, like, given you staples and stuff in the shop, like, to be able to access it early. Maybe even, it would have added to the game's campaign if you had, like, a stopgap around the middle of each side where you could unlock a shop, unlocking maybe even multiple shops, so one shop would specialize in monsters, one would specialize in traps, one would specialize in spells, one would specialize in, like, certain type of, like, I don't know, masked cards. There's just a lot of potential, especially with your imagination of what you can do with shops. And it would also just be a really good way, like, I don't know, maybe if you buy all the shop's cards, that shop would let you buy, like, a secret rare card you normally can't get in the game. Really, the fact that you can't get all the ritual cards in the game, like, I understand the point of the rituals is to unlock the other cards that gives you, the player, something to do, but it's the problem that creates not being able to obtain the ritual cards is that they're just essentially not worth playing. So the ritual system in the game creates some of the coolest cards in the game, but it makes them straight up unplayable because the ritual system is just absolutely fucked. It takes you for a minimum of like 3 turns to actually be able to play a ritual you want, so no one's going to play them. And considering the rituals are like the best cards, or some of the coolest cards in the game, like, you know, Cosmo Queen, Skull Guardian, Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, all those really cool cards, there's no point actually playing them when you can just play another strong spellcaster and stick equips on it in the same hand. So what happens is you have all these really cool cards, some of the coolest cards in the game, arguably. No one's actually using them, no one's playing them, no one's obtaining them because they're unobtainable. And, you know, these cards wouldn't even be that bad to give to the player because they're usually 7 stars or 8 stars or above. So they're actually pretty hard to bring out even if they were just their own cards. So the fact that fusions are weaker than other cards that are, like, unobtainable for no good reasons, it's just, like, ridiculous. The fact that you can't get, like, you can't play Cosmo Queen or Garma Sword, but you can play Blue Eyes White Dragon, it's just kind of stupid. I know they wanted to go for something special with the ritual system, but basically what they did is just fuck everyone else out of being able to use those cards that are really, really cool. More of these include, you know, the rare cards like Mirror Force and Ryoku. Something about Ryoku I can understand because that card's really, really broken, but the fact that they just let the enemies use all these cards and A, never let you get them, B, never explain you can't get them is really a fuckover. There was so many years, every player in the world, the first few years that this game was out, no one really knew if you could get these cards or not, you know. Everyone was very, very hopeful because the game was so mysterious and people had such little information of it, so people were actually really, really optimistic to get these cards. But it's actually impossible, so this is just a big problem, you know. You can't play with a lot of the cards you actually want to use. The game shows you some of the most awesome cards in the game, like Mirror Force, Ryoku, Cosmo Queen, but you can't actually fucking use any of them. If you want to use the rituals, you've got to use a 4-turn, shitty ritual system that they made to try and compensate the game's balance. You can only play 1 card per turn, so these are just really slow and inefficient, and I mean, even just look at cards like Nekigao. How is it that you can, you know, you can fusion summon something like Garvis by fusing a 1-star beast with a 2-star winged beast, but you can't obtain Nekigao, which is a 1-star female and any beast. It just makes no sense that you can't use Nekigao, Rabbit Horseman, when you can use cards like Garvis, you know, Chimera the Flying Mythical Beast. I really just do not understand their reasoning for not being able to give you the cards. I can, like, Summon Lord Exodia is not really technically a card, it just puts it in your library once you make that summoning condition. Every other card in the game, I think, should be obtainable in some way, shape, or form. The fact that it isn't destroys the game's replay value. If you want to go back and play this game, I know, I don't know how many of you guys actually know, a lot of my subscribers already know this, but for those of you who haven't watched me much, I have actually legitimately bought an American, American PS2, so I can play the American PS2 game, which I also bought with the cheating device that only works on the American system, just so I can play my favorite game with my favorite cards in the game. I had to buy a console from a completely, opposite side of the world, import it, pay all these, postage fees and all this shit, spend probably a good $200 just to play this 16, 18-year-old game, just to play all the cards that I want to be able to do, because there's no other way to do it. There's no proper way to cheat them in or do anything without actually buying a real cheating device. And having to buy all these antiquated devices just to play my favorite game the way I want to and use my favorite cards in my favorite game is a bit of a joke to me. It's actually a bit of an insult, and it creates so many problems when people ask how to get these cards, because the only option is to pay money to buy them. And it's not even like you're paying to win, it's just paying to have fun. It's a ridiculous amount of money, and I don't expect anyone to spend that amount of money buying these. If you already have an American console, it's not it's not unreasonable to buy like a $20 cheating device just to use these cards. But the fact that I had to buy a completely new console, new game, and the cheating device, including the fact that I have to, pay for these to be posted over by sellers that are trying to make profit, it really adds up, and it's just very, very, very disappointing to me that, 18 years after my favorite game, I need to use all these cheating devices, or anyone in the world who actually wants to play this game to the best of its potential needs to actually input cheating device that we've had to come up with ourselves, and, we've had to pretty much pull and move mountains just to be able to play this game the way we've wanted to for the last 18 years. Anyways, I want to thank you guys for being patient and sitting through the whole video. I'm sorry it wasn't really editing heavy, I just kind of felt like talking about the game. Lately I've been very burnt out about it, which explains some of the cynicism and complaints in this video. I know it's a critical video, but I feel like the time is right to criticize the game, considering I'm just having a lot of difficulty continuing playing it. I feel like I've really, even, considering I bought the cheating device and using all those cards, you're really limited in what you can do with the deck just because of the way the game is. You're forced to use low deck cost decks to duel the opponents aren't even worth dueling, you can't even use the coolest cards in the game, so you have to pull out all these stops to basically, do what you want to do in the game, and I really think overall they just could have done a better job. A lot of these criticisms are stuff they probably easily could have implemented in the game without actually a lot of effort. Something like the shop might have taken a bit more effort under time constraints, but stuff like making it faster to level up would have been a lot better considering they put so much effort into the leader ability system. I think they really just shot themselves in the foot with this game, and that really hurt the game when it came out. A lot of people really didn't like the game when it came out because of some of the problems with it, like just some things that weren't considered or they didn't think about. And overall, yeah, it just really ruined the legacy of the game, and I really feel like these problems with the game just contributed to the fact that we never got a sequel. We never got a proper sequel for this game because people weren't too keen on it because the game was flawed from the start. The game has a lot of other issues which I'll probably bring up in another video as to why it was not so successful, but overall I just wanted to talk about things I think would have been way better to have in the game if these were on the game. And it's not even like I mentioned a multiplayer lobby, I didn't bother mentioning that because this game was developed in 2001, so they probably didn't even consider that was a possibility. Even if the game had online mode, a lot of like the early 2001 games and stuff like that were only really using that Ethernet port for LAN connectivity anyways. And this game does have a 2-player function anyway, so I don't know, they did their best, I guess. I don't know what else to really say though, so I'm gonna end the video here, guys. Sorry, again, sorry it wasn't really editing heavy, it was just like background footage with some audio over it, but I hope you guys enjoyed it nonetheless, and I'll see you guys in the next video, whenever that is, so bye bye.